John Lennon is walking back towards the Dakota in New York City after having spent most of the day in the recording studio. Outside stands a fan Lennon had met only hours before, and John had even signed his copy of Double Fantasy. And now that same man is waiting outside with a revolver hidden beneath his coat. Within a few minutes, John Lennon would be dead, and the man who shot him would remain at the scene, calmly reading a copy of The Catcher in Rye until the police arrested him. One of them, a man who became one of the most famous people on earth, while the other is a man now infamous for his envy. Alright, I'm sorry, but I gotta do it. If you find yourself enjoying the video, make sure to like and subscribe and all of that. And also, as a small way to honor John, comment below what piece of his work you appreciated the most. Alright, back to the video. To understand how we got to the horrific scene that unfolded on the corner of West 72nd Street that day, we gotta rewind and understand the men involved. John West Lennon was born in Liverpool, England in 1940, while German bombs were falling all over the city. His father, Alfred, was a merchant seaman, meaning he was rarely home, leaving his mother, Julie, responsible for his upbringing. And though she loved him, she was not prepared to raise him. By the age of 5, John had effectively lost both of his parents and was living with his Aunt Mimi, and this gave him a much needed stability, but John grew up with the anger and resentment of a child who had been left behind. He covered it with jokes and rebellion until music gave that anger somewhere to go. Eventually, Julie did re-enter his life as he got older, and she taught him banjo chords and introduced him to American rock and roll records. And she encouraged the side of him that Mimi considered unrealistic. But then when John was 17, Julie was struck and killed by a car, and that loss hardened something already forming inside of John. Later, many of his most vulnerable songs will revolve around the wounds of abandonment, loneliness, and a desperate search for connection. In 1957, Lennon had formed a skiffle group called the Quarrymen, and at one performance, he had met a 15-year-old Paul McCartney, and Paul could tune a guitar properly and play songs John didn't know, so he invited him to the band. And with Paul later came an introduction to George Harrison, and all three were still teenagers, but the foundation for the Beatles now existed. John had found a way to turn the chaos inside of him into something other people wanted to hear. While Lennon was beginning to build an identity through music, there was another boy growing up 1,000 miles away who was learning to escape himself rather than express himself. Mark David Chapman was born in Fort Worth, Texas in 1955, and he was raised mostly in Decatur, Georgia. His father was a former Air Force staff sergeant and his mother a nurse. Chapman would later describe a home life ruled by fear, claiming that his father was cold towards him and violent towards his mother. And for a child like Mark, school had no respite. He had been quiet, unathletic, and frequently bullied. He had struggled in every aspect of life, but when he entered his bedroom, everything changed. He found the one place where he was no longer powerless. Chapman had created an imaginary civilization of little people who lived inside the walls of his room. So while inside, he was no longer a frightened child being ignored or humiliated. He was a king who they depended on and praised. And while that fantasy might sound harmless in a typical child, in Chapman, it's the first sign of a pattern that would follow him into adulthood. As a teenager, he would use drugs, skip school, and briefly ran away. And then at age 16, he became a born-again Christian, played religious music all the time, started carrying a Bible with him everywhere, and devoted his life to helping others. Chapman actually became a YMCA counselor and was reportedly excellent with children, making his story all the more disturbing. From the outside, the straight line from troubled child to murderer was interrupted by an apparent redemption. But in truth, each of his identities had always depended on feeling morally superior. When the admiration faded, so did the character he constructed. In 1977, after moving to Hawaii, he attempted suicide and was hospitalized. He later found work at that same hospital and married a travel agent named Gloria Abe in 1979. Once again, from the outside, Chapman appeared to be rebuilding, though internally, his sense of self was deteriorating. He began reading J.D. Salinger's The Catcher in Rye and became consumed by its teenage narrator, Holden Caulfield. Chapman did not simply relate to the character. He began using Holden as the next role he could step inside of, so he adapted Holden's hate of the phonies of the adult world. And the person that Chapman increasingly viewed as the ultimate phony was John Lennon. because Chapman once loved the Beatles. Like many of his generation, he played their songs and looked up to Lennon. But contradictions such as John having sung Imagine No Possessions while also living in the luxurious Dakota apartment buildings, and having once said that the Beatles were more popular than Jesus, were things that the New Holden persona couldn't tolerate. In truth, Lennon was contradictory because he was human, but Chapman wanted an idol who could never fail him. Once Lennon failed that impossible test, Chapman's admiration turned into hatred. Over the years, Chapman has wrapped the crime in religion, mental illness, and various other reasons. His explanation has shifted. None of them should be treated as the perfect window into his mind. But in later parole hearings, Chapman stripped away many of those explanations and admitted that jealousy and self-glory were at the center of the crime. He had felt insignificant and understood that if he were to kill a world-famous man, it would attach his name to Lennon's forever. The fantasy of the little people had expanded. He could no longer be satisfied by ruling an imaginary world inside his bedroom. He wanted the real world to know who he was. So in October of 1980, Chapman bought a .38 caliber revolver and flew to New York. He watched the Dakota, considered killing Lennon, and then he changed his mind and returned to Hawaii. He had stepped away from the edge and had every opportunity to seek help. Instead, he returned to New York on December 6th. And by this time, the boy that John Lennon had been in Liverpool was almost unrecognizable. The Quarrymen had become the Beatles. After years of performing in Liverpool and Hamburg, the group found a manager in Brian Epstein, a producer in George Martin, and a drummer in Ringo Starr. Then everything exploded. In 1964, they appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show, and over 70 million Americans watched. John Lennon, the abandoned child who hid behind humor, could now no longer enter a room without being seen. His mother's belief in him was right, but being seen by everyone did not mean being understood by anyone. The Beatles were becoming less like four men and more like a public property. There had been a box they needed to fit inside of now. But instead, Lennon responded by being more provocative and more political. He was doing this to destroy the clean image built around himself. And it worked. Eventually, the band dissolved, and in 1970, John moved to New York, released solo music, protested the Vietnam War, and became such a visible political figure that the Nixon administration actually attempted to deport him. Then in 1975, after the birth of his son, John had stepped away from music. The man who had spent his entire life chasing a connection through an audience was now a stay-at-home father. In 1980, he did return with Double Fantasy, and Lennon was publicly speaking about a new beginning. He had survived childhood abandonment, the death of his mother, unprecedented fame, drug use, the collapse of the biggest band in history, public hatred, and now the joys of fatherhood. For once, his future appeared brighter than his past. But as fate would have it, on the morning of December 8th, there was a man waiting outside who thought John's future could be traded away for his own glory. Lennon had given an interview about his return to music and the life that he had hoped to live. Outside, Chapman was still looming. At around 5 o'clock, John and Yoko would leave for the record plant. Chapman had approached, but it was with his copy of Double Fantasy. He asked John to sign it. A photographer, Paul Gorsh, actually captured the moment. John Lennon signing an autograph for a man who traveled to New York to kill him. Chapman could have again walked away. Instead, he waited for 6 more hours. At approximately 10:50 p.m., John and Yoko returned to the Dakota, with Yoko taking the lead and John following shortly behind. Chapman stepped from the shadows. 5 gunshots. 4 of those 5 shots struck Lennon from behind. John managed to stagger into the building before collapsing. Police had rushed him to the hospital, but the damage was catastrophic. John Lennon was pronounced dead at the age of 40. And Chapman? He remained near the entrance and began calmly reading The Catcher in Rye until police arrested him. He didn't resist, because he had already chosen the easiest path for history to remember him. In 1981, Chapman pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced 20 years to life. He achieved the recognition he wanted, but only by exposing he had no identity of his own. John Lennon became famous by taking his pain and turning it into music that millions of people could see themselves in. One created something larger than himself, and the other destroyed something larger than he could ever be. Their stories only met for a few seconds outside the Dakota, but from that moment on, Chapman's name would be attached to Lennon's, but not as Holden, the man who exposed a phony, but as a cowardly footnote in the life that a true legend had lived. Rest in peace, John Lennon.